Thank you, Max. Thank you all for coming in a squall. I told Max if there were this many people here, I would be amazed, and it's amazing that you're here. We're thrilled to be here. Some of us recently, some of us a long time ago, we're sitting right where you are, in exactly this. There's somebody here, more than likely, who is in exactly the same place that you are. So what we want to do is talk a little bit first about, and it's a little unorthodox, but we're going to talk a little bit about ourselves and just sort of how we made this path to where we are. Hopefully, it'll be instructive. And then there are just some topics that we want to talk about as it relates to jobs. It's a we can sugarcoat it or not, but it's a scary time to be coming into media. But people are doing it, and people are finding jobs that they love, and they're doing work that's really important. And we're in this kind of amazing moment where the market and the business model and the economics are really tough, but the stories are amazing. And the moment of history that we're living in is unprecedentedly important. And what an amazing time to come into journalism and be a journalist. So I both envy people coming in, and I also feel for it because it's tough, but it's amazing. So let's start just giving you a quick sense of how we did what we do. I originally promised you that I would start, but now I'm thinking that's not a good idea. So I'm gonna have Sean go first.
All right. Thank you, Kyle. So I started, I would say, 25 years ago. I usually don't admit that, but I will here for this panel. I started, my first TV job was at a network called America's Talking. For those of you who saw the Showtime Roger Ailes series, it was a network that he had started back in the 90s. It was a 24-hour channel devoted to different talk programming. So there was a show about parenting, there was a show about sports, there was a news, political show, entertainment. They basically had every type of show that you can think of topic-wise. It was based in New Jersey.
Wait, Sean, back up just a bit.
Yeah.
Where did you go to school?
I went to school at Montclair State.
And did you always did you know what you wanted to do?
I
or
always
you just
knew I wanted to be in television.
Okay.
It was something that I was just attracted to as a child. I am a TV junkie. I mean, I was a latchkey kid who came home from school, who was glued to the television and primarily would watch reruns of The Brady Bunch or Gilligan's Island, and then started sort of evolving into news and that sort of spoke to me. So I knew that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to do some sort of hybrid of both.
And so how did you get in touch with America's Talking? Like, what was the connection?
So I had no connection at all. All I knew is I watched it, and it was sort of the heyday of the talk show, and it was Sally Jesse Raphael and Jerry Springer and Jenny Jones and you name it. And so that I knew that that's where the jobs were, but I didn't really like that type of sort of conflict setting. So I studied watching this network. It was a fledgling network. It was in 20 million homes at the time. It was owned by NBC. It was the sister network to CNBC. It was based in Fort Lee. So for me, I'm like, okay, there's this network. It's in New Jersey. They have a lot of different types of programming with talent that I think they're okay, and it might be a good place to start. So I studied it. I basically came up with segment ideas for every single show, and put it all together and sent it over. There was no email, so I mailed it over to the person who was running the network.
And this was right out of college?
Yeah.
Were you like 22?
Yep.
Okay.
So I mailed it to her, and I got a phone call. And she said, I love the initiative that you took. Do you want to come in and meet us? And so of course, went. So I jumped at the chance, went. And I wasn't even home yet, and they offered me the job.
Oh my gosh.
So they said, we're doing a 10 p.m. Entertainment talk show. Do you want to work on that show? And I said, of course. So I went, and it was basically It was 5 days a week, live, got to do everything. Staffs were very small. Maybe there were 6 people that worked on that show. So everything from booking guests, I had no interaction with celebrity publicists or how to deal with them, or writing for TV, editing. We did everything. So I was there, and not long after, the powers that be at NBC decided that they were going to change that network into MSNBC, and I think there were 10 people that they called 10 of us into a room, and I thought, okay, well, they're firing the 10 of us. Well, or that was just sort of the first wave, and I was told, you are the 10 people we're saving.
Wow.
So you're now working at CNBC, the sister network, and it's a great opportunity. So I took it. I was there for a little while, and then there was another network that was starting up around this time called Fox News Channel, which also was run by Roger Ailes, who had left CNBC and America's Talking at the time. And if you saw the show, you know the backstory. And so he called a bunch of us and said, we're starting a new network. It's called Fox News Channel. It's going to be 24 hours of news programming done out of the News Corp building owned by Rupert Murdoch. And do you want in? So I said, sure. So I made the trip across the river, and I was a segment producer on the Prime show at the time, which was an 8 o'clock talk show hosted by Catherine Cryer, who they had just stolen from ABC News. It was a big hire for them.
Not to be impolitic about it, but this was before it was crazy.
Absolutely,
right?
Yes. Yes. I mean, it might have been crazy, but I didn't
As
see
crazy.
That.
Right.
So yes, it was definitely before the crazy times started. So, again, small staff, small budget. It was an opportunity and a fantastic one because you got to do everything. You got to do every job there. We literally walked in the first day. There were 350 employees that were hired. We all started on the same day. We were given a number, and all the number one, stand over here, all the number twos, and then that's how you knew what show you were on. So I didn't even know what hours I was going to be working. I just took the job, and they said, okay, you're on this show. It happened to be, honestly, in my opinion, the best show at the time, so I sort of lucked out. It was an interview show. That was their version of Larry King Live.
Uh-huh.
So it was politics, newsmakers, international news, entertainers. It was everything. So I was there literally there were no studios built. There was nothing. It was a Sam Goody record store when we started, and 6 weeks later we were on the air. So it was pretty ambitious, and everyone said it'll never last. You may get a year out of it. At the time, Rupert Murdoch was paying cable companies to carry it, where it was obviously everything else was in the reverse. Cable companies pay the networks, but he needed carriage, and it got it. And anyway, I was there for 3 years, and it was I was there for the impeachment of Bill Clinton, which obviously sort of changed everything there. That the network became much more political during that period. It sort of found its focus, for good or for bad. They report, you decide, was the slogan. And so I decided to leave shortly after that. And I
for sort of politics reasons.
I sort of kind of. I guess part of it was political.
Uh-huh.
I just sort of started to see a little bit of a shift.
Okay.
And I thought, okay, when it's time to go, and then I felt it. And so the anchor of the show that I was working on, she got an offer to be, they were going to revamp a network called Court TV. And it was a network that was owned by Time Warner and Liberty Cable, 24-hour network dedicated to crime and justice, and had access to courtrooms across America.
Right.
At the time. It had become sort of pretty popular during the O.J. Simpson trial, very popular during the mid-'90s. And they were going to revamp it because they had all lawyers working there.
So
and they needed TV producers.
You went there with a colleague from
so
Fox.
My anchor became the face of Court TV. And she said, we're starting a new show. Do you want in again? And
what were you doing?
So I was producing.
Okay. And so tell us how you got to CNN.
Yeah. So, okay. So I was at Court TV for 10 years, though. So that was a big part of my career. And then I'll be quick. So that was an opportunity to really do it all. I actually then became the executive producer of that show, worked my way up. I did every job, basically. Then I hired people, APs, writers, producers, segment producers, bookers, line producers, show producers, did it all. Fast forward, what year is this now? 2009. And they decided they were going to pull the plug and they were going to revamp Court TV, and it was going to become something totally different. It was going from courtroom, programming to comedy and reality at the time. So I saw a job at CNN. It was our sister network. We were owned by the same company, Time Warner. So it was in program development. And at the time, CNN ratings were not great. And I thought, okay, this is an opportunity for me to get out of the day-to-day producing of a show and do sort of more long-term programming and the opportunity to develop projects and really look, in the distance instead of just trying to do a show every day at a certain time. So I took that job, and I did that for a little while. That was for about 2 years. I was coordinating producer in program development. We did a lot of pilots. We brought people in that you would know, people in that you would not know. We tested them out. We did chemistry tests. We did panel shows. We did single host-driven shows. We did a lot. But it was an interesting time at CNN, and there was a change in leadership, and so a lot of projects that were sort of in the works did not go any further than that. At the time, they decided they were going to go outside for programming. The first time ever that they were going to acquire programming. Instead of doing it in-house, they wanted to work with the best producers around the world. And the first project that they had signed on to was the Anthony Bourdain show, Parts Unknown. So at the time, I then shifted into talent development, which is what sort of my current role is. I'm sorry, I know you said 5 minutes. I feel like I've been talking
No,
for
go
like
ahead.
20.
So tell us what talent
Okay.
development is.
So talent development at CNN, I'm primarily scout for on-air correspondents, anchors, and reporters around the world. We have bureaus around the world. We have obviously a big office here in New York, which is where I am. Atlanta is another hub for us. I am looking for the new face. I mean, I have an amazing job because I literally get to change the face of CNN. And it's great. I'm looking everywhere. I'm looking for people who are up and coming. I am looking for people who have many years under their belt. We have a lot of real estate. I mean, we have 4 networks. We have CNN, we have HLN, we have the international channel, we have CNN en Español, and we have a huge digital platform. So there is a lot of real estate and a lot of opportunity to bring new talent in. I am always trying to build the pipeline. In addition to my role recruiting externally, I am also involved in the internal development of correspondence. So that means coaching, whether it's tracking, their on-air performance, anything that really has to do with what you see on camera, their writing, putting together packages, all of that. So there's the external building the pipeline, and then there's the internal talent development side of things.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Holly?
Yeah, wow, I have such a different path,
Yeah.
but we have really similar jobs now, which is so interesting to me, and hopefully to other people. So I definitely grew up as a news junkie. We watched a lot of, 60 Minutes and McNeil Lehrer NewsHour when I was a kid, and I grew up in Maryland, so we read the Washington Post and the Baltimore Sun and the local paper. So I definitely grew up swimming in news. I took a high school journalism class. And I co-founded an alternative journal in college. So that was really fun and exciting to do that. But I didn't really think about a career in news particularly. Actually, when I left college, I started a PhD program thinking I would become a college English professor. So that was my first career goal, and decided pretty quickly that I was not going to do that after all, and left my PhD program with a master's thinking, what now? What was plan B? I didn't have one. And then I ended up getting a job being a writer and an editor for a medical publication or medical organization that had a publication, and at the time they were really cutting edge and thinking about developing a website, and this was in 1994. So like Al Gore and I were inventing the internet. As I learned HTML and I learned, all this stuff that my friends were like, what are you even talking about? I mean, my husband one time said to me, like, there's this internet thing you keep talking about. Why do you keep talking about this thing? And I was like, I'm telling you, it's the thing. I mean, we literally had these conversations. I mean, I just had the strangest job of my friends that, learning to code. I mean, what was I doing? So, I mean, but it's funny because all of that was so useful. And I also was doing some reporting for this medical news magazine and training people like doctors who belong to this medical organization on how to use the internet and how to think about the internet for their careers. So, I never could have imagined how useful that would end up being for me, but it really did. So then we moved to New York City for my husband to go to Columbia for his MBA program. And, I started to think about what should I do now. And I ended up being a marketing writer at the time, Big Six accounting firm, which I really hated. I was just completely miserable. And I thought, okay, and I actually had a job. I got a job at the Journal, the Wall Street Journal, working for their website, and I didn't take it, which I've thought about so often, like what would my career be if I'd taken it then? Just because I was supporting the two of us and it wasn't like enough money at the time because my husband was in school. So I ended up, I'm going to skip a little bit just because I don't want to be too long-winded, but I ended up deciding to go and become a teacher. So I went and got a second master's in education, and I became a high school teacher. And I was a high school teacher for 10 years, and I taught English and journalism and philosophy at some of the best schools in New York, and I also taught in London. And I advised student newspapers and just got so excited about working with student journalists. I was working at Stuyvesant High School on 9/11, and my students produced this amazing full-color magazine about the experience of, from the student perspective of what we went through that day, that got distributed in the New York Times throughout the tri-state area. Which was just like this really intense experience to go through with students. And really, I think, in a lot of ways rekindled my own love for being close to journalism, doing something journalistic, and also for fostering the journalistic talents of others. So that's something that really resonated very deeply with me. And then I ended up moving to another school, and the New York Times has this program called the Learning Network, and they were looking for contributors. And I reached out to them and said, I use the New York Times and other news all the time in my teaching. I teach journalism, I teach English, I teach composition, I use the Times as models, I teach philosophy, so I use all these articles. I have tons of lesson plans, I'll give them to you. And the woman who ran the program at the time got back to me and said, that's not really how it works. We don't want to just take your lesson plans. We write lesson plans off the news for teachers to use, on a daily basis. But actually, your background's super interesting. I've been thinking about bringing on a deputy editor. Would you be interested in doing that? And I was really into that idea because I prefer to be an editor to being a writer anyway. So I taught 5 days a week and advised a student newspaper, and 5 days a week after school for several hours I edited lesson plans and developed content for the Learning Network. And just really fell in love with that too, just the whole idea of the intersection of news and education and students. Because I knew from being a teacher that young people really love news and are really curious about the world, but they're often not really respected as news consumers by adults. Kids today, they don't care about news. No, it's actually not true. So I ended up leaving teaching and going to the Learning Network and working there as the deputy editor of the Learning Network for several years, during which time we completely changed what it was, with the look and feel and the content, all this stuff. And that feeling I had about young people and news and all that stuff really, took root with me, I guess. And I kept thinking, whenever we think about young people and news, we think of them as students, not as people in their own right. And we think about, delivering news through education. So we want to give you something that feels educational. We give it to your teacher gives it to you. Or like maybe to your parent, and your parent gives it to you. But what about just going to young people directly? And this is obviously the same time. This was like, I don't know, in the early 2000s when, the rise of social media. I thought we don't really have to go through the gatekeepers of parents and schools anymore. We can go to young people directly and treat them as, news consumers on their own right. And what if there were a thing that did that? There should be a thing that did that. And I just got so obsessed with this idea, I ended up leaving the Times to launch a news startup that none of you have heard of because it did not succeed, because I'm not a business person. If I had had a business partner, but interestingly enough, at the same time, other people were having similar thoughts. And that's like when Mike was born, it's when The Skim was born, it's when all these other things that were sort of aimed at a younger, social media oriented audience were born. But I made a go of it for 4 years, and I ran my news startup for 4 years. Really excited about this idea, and ended up getting the attention of USA Today. They were like, "We love what you're doing, and what if you come in-house and you do something like that here?" So I ended up going to USA Today first as a consultant, and then they hired me outright to run their college vertical and to work on other digital content. So I closed the startup, and I went to USA Today, and I did that for a while. And then after that, and I worked with a lot of student journalists across the country. They
And I'm going
decided
to have to speed you up to Quartz.
Yep. And then so Quartz I don't think ever would have happened if I hadn't had all of this. Like the fact that I had run a startup, which actually launched within a week of when Quartz launched. Funny enough, I was always really aware of Quartz and kind of like obsessively paying attention to what other startups at the time were doing. And so, when I saw that the Talent Lab job was open, I have to say this too, this is actually kind of important. My husband walked in the room and saw me applying for this job. I saw it on LinkedIn, and my husband was like, "Are you applying for a job on LinkedIn? Like just cold?" Like we have good networks at this point in our careers. You don't have to do that. And I was like, first of all, it's good practice to be looking around and to apply for things and to have to write your story and polish your resume. And second of all, I was kind of like, I actually don't happen to know anyone there right now. And I was actually aware of this job that I have now, Talent Lab Editor. I knew that they had it. And I had actually seen it like a couple of years earlier, and I was like, I want that job someday. So I was like, you know what? This is a job that really lines up for me in terms of like having done professional development. I taught journalists. I had coached young journalists. I really always wanted to help other people succeed in journalism, and I was like, this is the job for me. And lo and behold, it ended up working out. So I think there's lots of different paths to jobs, and sometimes it works out.
All right, Scott.
And there you go.
Where to begin? I'm not sure how far I want to go back. I'll tell this maybe sort of in 4 phases for me. But my first media job after college, I grew up in Colorado, not in a sort of media dense environment, but grew up reading Time magazine and really loved their lists, which became relevant later on in my life, and their entertainment coverage. And I was just like, I like magazines. Went to college at Pomona in California, and afterwards moved to the Bay Area, and this was 1999. So the internet was like really happening then, but there weren't a lot of media jobs on the internet. There weren't, I think just a few websites had really launched at that point.
It was the beginning of the crash too.
It was, yeah, I graduated, and then like 3 months later the crash happened. So suddenly it was very difficult to get jobs. But I was very lucky. I got my first like actual media job was at an alt weekly in Berkeley called the East Bay Express. And I knew I wanted to work there, but the only job that I could get, because I had 0 qualifications and I was right out of college, was working. I was like the assistant in their advertising department. So I'd like go out on like sales calls with the salespeople and take pictures of like local jewelry shops. But then once I was kind of in the door, I started writing music reviews and doing book reviews and kind of finding places that I could like find little things to do, started doing a little bit of feature writing. So it was like a really good foot in the door, and it was a small enough publication that it was really easy to like move and kind of do different things. So that was great. I enjoyed it. I had studied philosophy in college, and so I was still sort of similar to you, thinking like, do I want to go into the academy, and was looking at philosophy programs, and then looked at this one NYU program that was called Cultural Reporting and Criticism that I think they still have. It's a very high-flown name for a journalism program, but it was, it was about writing long-form features. So I applied to a bunch of PhD programs and NYU, and only got into the NYU program. And I was like, great, okay, fate has decided for me that I'm going into this new industry. But coming to NYU was really meaningful. I think, J school sometimes gets a bad rap. I think it provides a lot of value, and one of the values that it provided for me was all of my connections, my entire life had been lived in the West Coast. I had no connections in media. I knew nothing about how media operated as an industry. And my professors at NYU provide a lot of that context. One of them then also helped me get my first job after graduating, which was at salon.com. So I wrote entertainment stuff for them. I ran through the music section for them. I wrote a celebrity news column. This was like in the mid to sort of late 2000s. So like I'd get up every morning and read about what Paris Hilton had done that day. Like she was a very powerful cultural figure back then, which is hard to imagine now. And it was great. It was like a sort of a good grounding for getting really to grips with what was happening, I think, online at that point. This was sort of the era when sites like Gawker had recently launched. I remember really the sort of notion that you could launch a media publication and have it just be online was like a revolutionary idea. People had not done a whole lot of it. Salon was sort of the first wave of that. And I feel like Gawker was like very early in the next wave of it. But one of the sites that I also saw launch during that time was this little website called BuzzFeed. And I liked what they were doing, and I knew Jonah Peretti, who's the CEO founder, like a little bit socially. And so just emailed him and was like, hey, what are you doing with this? It seemed like a really interesting intersection of technology and editorial skills. And so we met, and he was like, you should come and work for me. Like, quit your job at Salon and come to this little office in Chinatown on Canal. And we've got this little media lab, and we're trying to figure out like what's happening with internet media. So I did that. And then much to my surprise, I was at BuzzFeed for 12 years. Like I thought for sure it would go under or be sold very quickly. And when I left, I remember I met with some friends who worked at other publications here in New York. I was like, I'm thinking about taking this job at BuzzFeed. And they're like, what is BuzzFeed? What are you talking about? Terrible name. And I felt like I was really leaving journalism, for good. But over the course of time, obviously, BuzzFeed grew into a much different, media organization than what it was when I started. So that was me until about 2 months ago, when I joined Medium. I'd watched Medium's growth over the years, was a user of it early on. I used to write a newsletter there. But for me, I had sort of done, I think, everything I could do at BuzzFeed. I really loved my time there. I obviously was very lucky to get to grow with the company, but wanted to focus on some new challenges, and I'm really excited about what Medium is up to. So I can talk a little bit about that maybe at some point later. I don't feel like I totally know everything that they're up to because it's only been 2 months. But they're, as an organization, I think they're very focused on kind of this idea of where are the jobs going to be, because I think what jobs are going to look like for journalists at Medium, and I think a lot of the digital publications are changing pretty rapidly.
Danielle.
So I grew up in South Florida, from a place called Boca Raton, which people know from like Seinfeld and The Nanny. It's where people go to retire. And I actually grew up like loving magazines, but not realizing I could do it. I was reading YM, I was reading 17. I loved like the Delia's catalogs, which was like this, I think it's now defunct now, but it was like a fashion catalog, and they had like a little section where they had what would now be considered like blog writing, sort of. But I actually wanted to be a fashion designer. I had no intention of going into journalism at all. If you had asked me about like what I watched. I would have told you like Ed Bradley on 60 Minutes and Christian Amanpour on CNN, but I just thought that was normal for kids to just like enjoy serious reporting. I just enjoyed it, but I didn't think I wanted to do it. And so when I graduated from high school, I went to Howard University in DC, and I went in as a business major, totally like blind to like, I'll do fashion at some point, and this like journalism thing is something that's cool, but I'm not really into it. After talking to a friend, and they say the average, they say in college you average 3 times switching majors. I did 3 times. I came in as business, then pre-law because my parents, and then the third was journalism for me. And I minored in fashion merchandising, still thinking I was going to do fashion, like get a clue. But I also joined the school newspaper, and I went from a writer to an editor, to the lifestyle editor, and then eventually the managing editor of the Hilltop, which is like Howard's really pretty old newspaper. And so at that point, by senior year, I was like, okay, I'm gonna do this, but we'll see what'll happen. My senior year was also 2009. So it was right after the recession, or right during the recession, sorry. And it was really rough to find work. So at that time, there was a lot of talk about internships versus like jobs. It was like, just get in the door and figure it out. And so I applied ahead of doing that, I applied for this course at Columbia University. I don't know if they still do it, the publishing course, where it's a 4-week intensive course where at the time it was, I think, 1 week was newspapers, 1 week was publishing books, another was magazines, and then at the time they were kind of venturing into web. This is 10 years ago, and now I'm pretty sure they fully do web at this point, if they still do it. But I got into that, which was great, and that was sort of my sort of path into New York, because the biggest thing was, as long as I get here and I get something, I'll figure it out. So I got that the senior year after I graduated school, and did that, had 2 other jobs. I had an AmeriCorps job. I was a hostess at a restaurant in Brooklyn. I had all these jobs that I was doing. It was hilarious. And after running around and getting an internship at Vibe magazine, I eventually got a full-time job at Glamour, which was my first job back in 2010. So 2010 to 2011, I was at Glamour.
How did you get that?
I got that job through the Columbia Publishing course. So the head of the Columbia Publishing course just was amazing. It was an amazing woman named Lindy Hess. And she wanted me to meet somebody who had graduated from the course at one of our mixers. And the person that I met was working at O. And we just stayed in contact, and I was like, I love anything. I'm just working for internships. I'm just trying to get anything in the door. So she kept me in mind. And so when she was leaving O, so was her boss, and her boss was going to Glamour. And she knew she would need an assistant. And so she called me up. She was like, hey, my boss is coming to Glamour. You should meet her. I met her in the cafeteria at Hearst at the time, because she hadn't left O yet, excuse me, to move to Condi. And we met, we hit it off. I did an edit test and had the job within like 2 weeks. And that was my first job. And so I was assisting 2 senior editors. And it was a lot. I mean, that was probably, I'll spend the most time on that. That was sort of the job that I had to do the most grunt work, but I also learned the most. Because I was an assistant, but I was also doing admin. I was also doing fact checking. I was also pitching stories. I was also writing stories. That was sort of the period of time too where magazines were just kind of transitioning from being on print to web, which literally at the time was copy and paste from print to the website. And so we were trying to be a little bit more dynamic with blogs. So I wrote a blog. But that was really a job that like got my feet wet. And so I did that for a year. And at that point I was still permalance. And that's when the word permalance was kind of floating. And so I was permalance for a year, and at that point I was like, I need benefits.
The job that they hired you for was A permalance job.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. It was a permalance assistant job for 2 editors.
Okay.
Which, you know, I mean, it's still, I think it's probably lessened these days.
I think the Department of Labor had problems with that down
Yeah,
the
well,
road.
yeah.
They don't do that as much. At
They probably don't do it as much. Yeah. In general, though, it was kind of a thing at the time. But yeah, so did that, and then I decided, you know what? If I'm gonna just freelance, let me just freelance. And I did for a little bit, and I was at This Old House for a little bit, and People Style Watch, which is now no longer. And then I got a full-time job at this now defunct, a lot of defunct publications, site called Style Blazer, which was a fashion site. I was there for 4 years, and I moved from just like a section editor to pretty much the EIC of Style Blazer before they folded, and I was there for 4 years. And from there, I just met people. I met a lot of people in the industry. I went to a lot of events. You know, you go to shows like fashion shows or screenings or all types of things, and you just meet people. And you know, when things are rough in whatever field you're in, you let people know, keep a lookout for me, what have you. And so what ended up happening is one of my friends from or coworkers from Style Blazer went to Essence, and at that point, you know, this is 4 years into this job, and they had shut down Style Blazer. She called me and she's like, "Hey, Essence is looking for a writer. You know, it's just a freelance position, but you know, they'd love to have. I know you can do it." And so I came in as a writer, but by the time I left, I was the entertainment editor for the website. That was about 2 years I was there, which was an amazing job, just an amazing place to work in terms of elevating voices of color and just really telling stories that I've never been able to tell in the way that we did. And that was 2 years there, and then Vice came knocking. And Vice, I started at Vice, believe it or not, September of last year. I was there for 9 months, and I was at a site called Broadly, which was their identities, women's vertical within their digital portfolio. Again, no longer, but it's like a common
All of us.
Right? Absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, it's media though, that it happens. And so yeah, I was at Broadly for 9 months, and I always say that you know, Broadly was so special because I feel like our reporting was so intentional and so thoughtful in how we, you know, use gender pronouns and how we report about specific communities and how we assigned stories and the type of writers we would give to stories. We never wanted to be exploitative about how we wrote about people or communities. And I think Broadly was really, really great at doing that and really elevated my writing and my editing. And I was there for 9 months. And towards the end, when there was talk of, you know, sort of combining verticals and the shutdown of certain sites within Vice, Teen Vogue came. And I spoke to the editor-in-chief, Lindsay, who I didn't know, but she reached out to me. And she reached out to me and she was like, "I love your work. And I'd love, you know, we have this new role open and I think you'd be great for it." We had a phone conversation. We hit it off. You know, edit test, and about a week later, I had the job. And so I've been there for about 6 months now, and like every other job before, it's tested me in ways that have stretched me. But what I love about where I am now, you know, I don't know how much you guys read the site, but it is such a great platform for young voices right now, and I think that young voices are so important to just the climate of the country and just so many different topics where, you know, young people really want to be infused in. And so it's a beautiful marriage of sort of my past experiences of writing and reporting and intentionality and being thoughtful about certain things, but then also just giving a platform for young people to shine. So yeah, it's been 6 months and I'm very happy.
Great. Thank you.
That's my story.
I know I said that I would do this too, but I lied. I'm really not. I'd rather talk more about. So this actually came out as I hoped it would, which was Sean started knowing what he wanted to do, which is my story, and I knew from the time I was 6 years old that I wanted to be a journalist. But then there are others here who are like, "That's not what I started out wanting to do," and then you start sort of doing what you can and you sort of build it up and you use networks. And so for anybody, based on what we've just learned here on how all of you did this, is there anything different in the climate today that makes that where one element of this will really stand out, given what's happening in the world, given what's happening in the job market, this is the one thing that if you really have to break through, this is what you need to be paying attention to. Anybody have any thoughts about something that really stands out?
I mean, I do, just speaking from CNN's vantage point. Right now, specialty is key. So general assignment, people who can cover everything, that's great. But we need people who are experts in their field. So back to beat reporting, covering the Justice Department, covering regulations in aviation out of Washington. I mean, there are so many beats in DC. Covering law enforcement and terrorism and ICE, I mean, immigration, that's really important for us. And it's harder and harder to find. But when we find someone who has an expertise in a certain area, that they rise to the top for us. So that has changed over the last few years.
And what's interesting about that is that you can choose to develop that beat yourself. You don't have to be hired by a trade publication that only does that. You could just, if you're a freelancer, you could make that your freelance specialty. Who else? What others?
I would actually add on to that, which I really agree with. I think like when I graduated, there was sort of a wave of being a jack of all trades, master of none, and I think we're getting to the sort of niche reporting. And to add to that, I would just say, just make sure social media-wise, you're tweeting about what you are interested in, you're Instagramming, you're writing about, you're pitching about. I always say when I'm looking for writers that are sort of, if there's a topic that I need written about, and I know that you tweet about this a lot, if I follow you and I know your writing is good and I know you can turn in clean copy and you're great to work with, more than likely I'm going to go to you because you're always talking about the specific subject or it's your expertise. There's so many different subjects these days where you just kind of don't want somebody who's not familiar. I mean, like at Vice, we obviously did a lot of writing about cannabis, and so I would always need people who are it's very scientific. As much as it's a recreational thing, it's very scientific. And so if I know that's sort of your beat and it's a space that you're specialized in because you're always talking about it, that's who I'm going to. So just lean into that publicly as well. In addition to your writing, like publicly lean into whatever your expertise is.
Can we talk about the downside of the social media element? You make the point that you need to be out there. I mean, when I look at hiring people, that's one of the first things I do. I look at their feeds, and mainly it's just because I want to hear their voice and I want to sort of see what they're interested in. But what about mistakes that people make on social media that hurt their job chances? I mean, it's obvious, but talk a little bit about it.
I mean, I would say the number one is underusing it. I mean, I think like the cliche is like, don't put up pictures on your Instagram of drinking. I mean, I feel like those are so obvious. I wouldn't even, bore you with those because you can Google like, job advice and social media and you're going to get that stuff over and over again. But to your point, I think if you're a journalist, like journalists live on Twitter, right? It's just whether you like Twitter or not, we tend to live on Twitter. If you're an aspiring writer, and it may not be true for some other jobs, but certainly if you're an aspiring writer or editor, you should be part of that ecosystem, and you should use it. I mean, like I've looked at someone today who applied for something and they hadn't tweeted since 2017 and they're applying for a social media job. I mean, it gave me pause. I'm not gonna lie. I was like, tell me, but it doesn't necessarily like mean that I won't talk to them, but I'm definitely gonna talk to them about that. Like, okay, tell me what you're doing. I mean, maybe they abandoned that account and they're using a different one, or there could be a good reason there, or a really good story. Maybe they're getting harassed, or maybe they switched to Instagram and they have a really good reason why, or whatever. So I'm open-minded about it, but it definitely gives me pause. So I would definitely say, and to your point also, like if you are developing a beat, that is a place for you to show that. So even if you don't have a job right now, you can be developing your voice and developing your expertise and developing your network. My first hire for my startup was a woman I met on Twitter. She was tweeting really interesting things about journalism and the future of news and innovation. And I reached out to her cold and was like, hi, I saw that you tweeted that you're moving to New York. She was from Canada. I'm starting this startup. I would love to talk to you about it. And we had coffee, and she was my first hire. And I've hired other people based on, people I've met on social media. So yeah, I definitely think you should be aware of your footprint and what it would look like. And if you want to have a Finstagram and you want anyone to know and you want to use it privately with your friends, no one would begrudge you that. But be careful that you're not findable, because I have found people who are really low profile. I have sleuthed out, and I'm sure everyone here could do the same thing. So, so I would say be careful about that. If you really want to, be private about that, go ahead, or lock your accounts or whatever. But definitely have a LinkedIn, and don't just say like writer. I mean, populate your accounts. It will definitely help.
And also, I mean, when there was a time eons ago when it was hard just to get published. Like that was the game. Like you got to get somebody to publish your stuff. That doesn't exist anymore in the sense that if you're not working, you can still publish your stuff on your blog, on Medium, on wherever as a freelancer, and it's so critical that there's something out there that people can read and start to get a sense of you. I was running the New York Observer, and I was looking for a managing editor, and somebody on the staff pointed me to this. There was a blog about being single and dating in New York for like much people who were much younger than me. So it wasn't for me, but I read this thing and I was so taken by this woman's voice and her sort of just worldview and the way she wrote. I hired her as a managing editor, and she stayed longer than I did. I got fired. She didn't. And then she's since written a couple of books, and but if she hadn't, and she wrote that only because she didn't have anything else to do. So if that is where you are, just write. Just write whatever it is that interests you.
Yeah, I would so strongly second that. I think of anything that sort of would jump out in an applicant's application. It's seeing both that entrepreneurial, like they're out there making things happen, but also getting a chance to really see their voice. I think, you guys don't know this, but like on the other side of the hiring sort of relationship, we are desperate to find talented people. That is the thing that anyone who's doing hiring is looking for. And I feel like now it really is an advantage to have so many different areas that you can signal to a potential employer. Here's my voice, here's what I'm interested in, here's what I'm good at. Like you have to be thoughtful about it, and it does take work. I think it's much easier probably for students to be doing that than if you have a full-time job doing other things. But for me, the things that stand out similar, like I have a lot of stories like that of someone who wrote a blog about a particular topic or had a Twitter account that was dedicated to a very specific thing, but that was just really interesting and showed their thoughtfulness and their voice. You've got to embrace that.
Danielle was talking about freelancing and how you freelance and permalance, and I think there's probably not a single one of us who hasn't had some period in our career where we've been between jobs and freelance. But can you talk just a little bit about the mechanics of that today, and what people need to be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I've spent a lot of time recently thinking about that just because I think in my mind in school, if I go back, I was very much taught how to be a on-staff writer, journalist, where you're given assignments from editors, you have a beat, and you work within that space. It's not practical these days. At some point, you're going to be a freelancer, and a lot of people start off freelancing before they get a full-time job. And freelancing is an entire business. It's existed as long as journalism has existed, and I think that's a muscle that I think is very much refined through trial and error. I always say when you are thinking about freelancing, approach it as, the low-hanging fruit. So I'm the entertainment director, and so I have a team of writers and editors on my staff already. So if, say, whatever movie's coming out, more than likely somebody on staff, if it's for Teen Vogue, is going to cover it. So to pitch, I want to do a review on this movie doesn't make any sense. Somebody's going to do it already. Find that nugget within the show, within the movie, whatever it is, that's low-hanging to pitch. An example is Euphoria, which was like a really great show for us. It's on HBO. It's amazing. We've done reviews of it, but I got a really great pitch about one of the specific characters who's a trans character. She's trans on the show. She's trans in real life, but it was about what trans teens think about her in terms of visibility. Where versus giving a review of the entire show, it's one character with one community and talking about how they relate to this character. It's the low-hanging fruit. It's not the obvious pitch. And I think that's kind of the mistake a lot of people make, where I get pitched, I'd love to do a cover interview, or I'd love to do this big thing. And I'm like, think about the little granular pieces that make up a really interesting conversation. And then just make sure that pitch email is tight. The subject line should have not too many words, but have what the pitch is in it, like pitch, whatever it is. Hi, give me like 3 or 4 sentences about who you are, and then give me the pitch in itself with experts you're going to source in there, what the thesis or the net graph essentially is of what your piece is about, the direction of where you want to take your piece, word count and deadline if it's tagged to like a specific moment, or if there's like a date that it's sort of pegged to, put that in there as well, and then close it out. Like just learning how to like just pitch an email, especially cold, is major key, because a lot of times that's your first step into the door. So if you can pitch right, it can take you a long way.
That was like amazingly helpful.
Seriously.
Because
Very
I mean, the thing
Yeah,
that
so
every,
helpful.
Was I wrong? I mean, I don't know if you guys like pitches
Exactly.
differently, but
No,
that's
I
how
mean,
I
Not
like my
even
pitches.
one word different. No,
the
that
thing
was
that
amazing.
the thing that all of us
Listen to
we're
that.
all in the same boat in the sense that we get this stuff wanting it to work.
Yeah.
Every email pitch we get, we're like, great, like this is going to be awesome. And then I have to tell you, yeah, there's a little bit of this, but this is what it's concise. That you really got to know the publication. I mean, we get a lot of.
Yes.
I work for the Columbia Journalism Review, and we get sports pitches. We don't do sports.
Right.
And this happens to everybody. It happens all the
Everybody.
time.
We get it too, of course. We don't cover sports. Yeah.
Danny, the way you phrase that, I really like. Like, you should think about it like, what's the problem I can solve for this person, for the editor on the other side. And if you can get that right, it changes everything.
It's really helpful, and it's interesting, like, because that piece actually did really well. That Euphoria piece did really well versus our other content, our other coverage of the show. People love those little conversational moments that they noticed or they thought about, but they didn't realize could be a whole story. So that's the stuff that I love.
And I would add to that when you are actually applying for like a posted role, you use that same advice, but orient it towards the job itself and not just the pitch, right? So like I get a lot of people applying for jobs at courts, and the ones that rise up for me are the ones that have those elements, that where you're thinking about the other side. I mean, I get a lot of things like, I would like to work there because of this. This is what this job would do for me. And that's great. I'm so glad this will help you in your career. But you need to tell me how you are going to contribute to the publication, to our readership. What are you bringing to the table? Because I'm not just here to just hand out, favors for people. That's not my job. Right now, my job is to actually hire. So I would say, like, take that and refine it when you're actually applying for a job, even if you're applying cold, to actually connect the dots between your experience and your ideas. Like, if you don't have a lot of experience, like, that might be okay. If I'm hiring for, an early career journalist for a job, then you don't need to apologize for that. You don't need to gloss over it. In fact, I would say do the opposite. Lean into that. What have you done? And turn what you have done so far and what you haven't gotten to do yet into a story. Like, connect the dots between what I'm looking for, what I wrote on the job description, and what you've done so far. Like tie it all up with a bow for me, so I don't have to fill in the gaps and fill in the blanks. And literally pitch yourself to me as you would pitch like a really good story idea.
So we've talked about what comes to us, but part of all of our jobs is to go out and find people, to find people who may not be on our obvious radars, to find a diverse group of people. What are you doing on the outreach front?
Yeah, I mean, most of my job, I am out there looking for people. I'm not receiving. I am part of the team that we, a few years ago, have decided we are going to go out to a different city every month and spend 2 days looking for local reporters in their market. So instead of having them, waiting for them to come to New York or dealing with their agents, we're going to see who the best and brightest are in that city and go meet them where they are. And so we've been really aggressive about that, and we've made some really good hires. But we are constantly scouting. I mean, we are so it's just back to social media for 1 minute. We're looking for people. So you may not know we're looking at you. Okay. So be prepared because we are. And I need to know your story without even talking to you. So it's really important, to make sure that your political views are not on your social media, because if they are, I'm probably going to keep moving. So that's something that we look at carefully. We've had a lot of people, who have said or have posted things that are just not appropriate. And CNN's social media policy is really strict. So, we can't. There's no room for error there. So anyway, back to your question. Yeah.
So how are you, when you go to these local markets, how are you getting the word out that you're there, that you're looking?
So what we also have started is we have done a day-long event on a Saturday. And we will reach out. I'll look through, there are only so many stations in a market. So we go to Seattle, and I will look at some people, and we will invite them to maybe spend a couple hours with us. We will we'll have sort of speed dating interviews where we sort of get to know them.
But these are people who are already on the air?
They're already on the air, yeah. So they may not have a ton of experience, and these are people who have just started out. I mean, it depends what market. I mean, we've gone to smaller markets, we've gone to larger markets. But these are people who are starting out and people who are, well into their careers.
Mm-hmm. What else? What else on the outreach front, Scott?
Medium, I mean, this is very specific to the way that Medium works because it is both a platform and more recently a publisher. We have a whole team of people who are looking on Medium itself as a platform, as a source to bring stories into the magazines that we've launched on Medium. And they're looking specifically for diverse voices, people with an authentic story to tell. But it's a team now of about 7 people who are just, their job is to go out onto the platform of Medium and find interesting stories to bring into the publications, and then ideally to then develop ongoing relationships with those writers. So it's exciting. It's this kind of weird nascent thing because it exists in that overlap between trying to be a publisher and trying to be a platform. But the thing I like about it, like if it works well, it can be a real source of diversity of voices. And I think also diversity of backgrounds, like not people who think of themselves necessarily as writers or journalists, but maybe just happen to be very good writers or really good storytellers or have something very interesting to say. And this is a means that I think we can discover them.
We'll be taking questions. So if you want to line up to either this mic or that mic and just tell us who you are, and thank you. Go ahead.
Hi. So I'm a sports writer at a small website in Brooklyn. You guys have talked a bit about how you go about finding talent today, but the name of the session is where will the journalism jobs be? So what would you guys tell someone who wants to be in the industry in 10 years? Or like teenagers who want to study it at college? Like where will they be?
We don't know.
I think you got one hint. I think you got one hint with the specialization thing. The main piece of advice that I've seen work broadly, because none of us know what the platform is going to. None of us know whether it's going to be podcasting or video or
Direct to consumer
or wearable or whatever it is. But I think that what's proved to be long lasting is sort of reporting. People who, I think people who are who've shown an ability to kind of take initiative on stories, and like this example that you gave about the approach to the movie, to like take something that's sort of obvious and then find a novel way in. I think is always going to be key. I mean, I think we went through a period recently where there was a lot of just first-person narrative life stories, and there was a lot of those, and it was very hard to stand out in those. And what emerged out of that were people who really were
Think pieces, yeah.
Yeah, were people who really sort of put a lot of thought and did real reporting and thought in a kind of traditional storytelling way, as opposed to a opinion-y kind of way. I don't know.
I mean, I would say content creation is I think we can pretty much say content creation is the future. What that will live on, who knows? Is it going to be on, Twitch? Is it going to be on Instagram? Is it going to be on Snapchat? Is it going to be, I think there'll be more platforms to come in the next 10 years. But I think that if you can figure out a way to make content and tell a narrative authentically, whatever that platform may be, that's the best way to adjust to whatever the industry is. When I started, it was all about like blogs and WordPress and like having your own blog. And then everybody was like, run to video. So everybody ran to video to try to figure that out. And then everybody was like, run to branded content. And so everybody was running. I think you just need to know how to make a story that is authentic, live in whatever space that is. So I know a little bit about coding. If something happens while I'm walking out, I know how to take out my phone, record it, and probably cut it up a little bit. You just have to kind of be like, analogous, or is that the right word? I don't know. You have to be able to sort of be a chameleon, and whatever that future medium is, figuring out how to use it a little bit and still tell a story in the best way possible, I think.
I think you also have to follow the trends. I mean, I think it's really important. I mean, the news cycle, obviously, over the last few years has been very different than it's ever been. So for us, if you're looking ahead, I mean, immigration is obviously a very hot topic. Healthcare, climate crisis. I mean, just follow the trends as to where things are going. No one has a crystal ball and can predict it, but I think that would serve you well looking into the future.
I think your question about where the jobs are going to be, I mean, one way of thinking about that question is like which places are going to be continuing to be hiring robustly. And one thing we haven't really talked about, among many things, but at the intersection of journalism and jobs, is the last couple of years have been pretty tough in our industry, right? A lot of jobs have been lost, and the business models for news have been complicated and tricky, and a lot of great publications, as everyone here mentioned, have fallen by the wayside. Sometimes because of the business models, right? So I would say that one of the places the journalism jobs are going to be in the next couple of years, I don't know about 10. But in the next couple of years are places that are thinking really as robustly and as well about their business model as they are about their journalism and the platforms and the distribution and stuff like that. I think that that like this year, for example, reader revenue is like one of the big things. Like that's something Quartz is doing. We launched a membership model, and product and a paywall, and other places have done similar things this year. There's other kinds of, you mentioned branded content. We've been experimenting with different kinds of models, and there are some places that, are doing, better at that than others. So in terms of the question of where are the jobs going to be, probably the places that are figuring that out are going to be able to hire more.
I am biased because I work for a nonprofit, but I think there's a ton of really interesting action going on in the nonprofit world in journalism. And knowing who the funders are, knowing who's giving money to this stuff, and kind of getting in those networks, even on social media, just to sort of see what kind of, I have friends who have pitched journalism startups to foundations and gotten funded. There's a ton of money, foundation money, wanting to fund journalism right now. So that's something I would keep a keen eye on.
I think the one other thing I'd add, we've been talking, I think, very focused on people who are probably going to be reporters or editors, maybe. It's been a long time since I've written a story. Oops. I think there are a lot of jobs in journalism that are around the journalism. And for me, that's been very satisfying. I really wanted to be a writer. It's not really where my career went. And I think giving yourself skills to have options to do other things, if you just want to work in the industry, and you're not dead set on being a beat reporter, I think giving yourself data skills, understanding product, specifically in the realm of digital media, I feel like there's a whole host of sort of adjacent things that can really give you the chance to work in the industry and move around as it changes.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sharif. I go to Montclair State too. So yeah. Well, I have a few questions actually, but my thing is I'm in the middle of having my own radio show on campus. Also, I also want to be a contributor writer for the newspaper. However, it hasn't been really falling through well because like you have to like take a test. You have to like write certain articles, and then like after 3 articles they choose you. And this is my second semester and I haven't got chose. So I'm trying to say, what can I do to become like a better writer? So that way I can just be, so I could be like I could be well rounded when I graduate and go into like the real world.
What year are you?
I'm a junior actually.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm a junior.
What journalism do you read?
Well, I read a lot of like pop culture. Mostly pop culture is my interest. So yeah.
And do you want to be a pop culture writer?
Yeah.
Yeah. And who are like the writers, and what are the publications that you're?
Well, I read a lot of Teen Vogue. I read a lot of Harper Bazaar. I read a lot of 17 magazine. So I also like read like BuzzFeed as well, like the little segments they have. So, I know what I want to do. I just haven't found my niche yet. So I was just like wondering, like, what would your advice be if you was in my shoes and stuff like that?
Well, I ask those questions because that's like the first thing I would suggest is, reading great journalism in the areas that you're interested in, and also beyond that, right? So because you can always use, writing tactics and approaches and adapt them from other topics and disciplines and use them and put them to work. So I think it's great that you're reading the kinds of things that you want to write, because you will find really good models. And I would say expand from that, right? So read sports. There's a lot of amazing action description in sports that you can learn, for example, of one of many things. Read politics, read, finance, read a lot more across the industries, like the first thing I would suggest, because the more you read, the more you're going to get steeped in, a lot of really writing approaches and voices that you may see yourself in or may not, but that's instructive too. So that's the first thing I would say. And other people can say what other things.
And I would say too, when you read and there's a piece that you particularly like in whatever publication that you do like, look at the structure of it. I always talk about how I love Danielle Smith's writing, she's like an OG hip hop journalist, editor, but I always kind of start when I write my first sentence of any piece, I kind of keep it short. My first sentence is like a couple of words, and then just to like snapshot of the moment. Like I literally I read it for technicality and tonality and flow, and what makes sense in an interview versus a write around or versus a Q&A intro. How does that flow work in terms of the story building? At one point if it's an interview, what point do you talk about where they're from versus where they are now in their career? It's those mechanical stuff that I think is really key too. So if there's a piece that grabs your attention, like why? Like what is it about that storytelling? Was it very vivid? Did you feel like you walked away knowing the subject well? What made it a good piece, like in its technical terms? Because more than likely it went through a great editor as well. And I find myself too, you said that before, I actually enjoy editing now more than writing, because I was called when I was at the Root, I was an intern at the Root years ago, and I was called a surgeon because I always cut and paste and moved things and cut out things. There's such a fine sort of art to editing, and so just looking at that mechanical sort of aspect will really help as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank
I'll
you.
give you one more. Go ahead. You said you had a bunch.
Also, like I live in Asbury Park, so it's not that much media opportunities out there. I've tried to, I work with what I can get. So like at Starbucks, I ran our social media webpage. So I went to Harvard for the communication and public speaking event. So I went to that. So my thing is, what would your advice be for someone who is seeking opportunities but little experience?
I think I would fall back to the fact that there's all these opportunities, that there's no gatekeeper between you and putting stuff out in the world. So you mentioned you have a radio show, whether that's audio or writing that you're doing. I just feel like, again, if you were an applicant for a position that I was hiring for, even if you didn't have a lot of experience, at a publication, if you had writing that I could look at, if you had work that I could see in whatever format, start an account on Medium, start putting stuff up on
How do you spell
SoundCloud.
that, Medium? How do you spell that?
Medium?
Yeah. How do you spell
Medium.
Oh, okay.
Like small media?
Yeah. But I just feel like I do really like, I believe very much in the power of the fact that people who are interested in media can make it without having to ask anyone for permission and that is, again, valuable for people who are looking for, for talent.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, great.
My question was originally directed to Holly, I believe it is. Sorry.
Yeah, hi.
But then Danielle mentioned the exact thing that I was going to ask about, so I ran up here. You did mention that you prefer editing over writing, and that stood out to me immediately because I personally always believed that you have to be an awesome writer to be an editor. I thought that was the sequence it took. So could you explain that a little further about how you prefer? And everybody can contribute, obviously, but
Do you want to start?
Oh, yeah, I'll start. I actually thought about that the other day. It's almost like the chicken or the egg. I don't know if any response is right, and maybe you'll tell me. I feel like you have to be a decent writer to be a good editor. You don't have to be, the world's greatest writer to be an editor, but you do need to understand flow, syntax, obviously basic grammar, all that stuff. But there is a skill to me. Good writing to me is being able to say a lot in few words. That's just my opinion. Being able to explain, a story or a setting or something with very few words, but you get it. And so to me, that's why I always cut. I don't like too many words. That's just my style. And so I think that came from being a writer and being edited constantly and looking at the changes happening. And so I noticed what was being cut, what was being kept, the flow, things that were moved. And so I do the same thing and I apply that to my writing. So I guess it's about being a good writer that's open to edits to be a good editor. And then also sort of, paying attention to, there's just so much, I don't know, I guess you guys could probably speak more on it, but and reading a lot, it really helps because if you read a lot, I think subconsciously you're kind of getting a flow in your mind of how certain stories work that are well done. Okay. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I would say for me, it definitely connects for me to my background as a teacher, helping people, craft their voice and learn things like structure and development and completeness and coherence and all the hallmarks of great writing. And I guess it's also a little bit of a temperament thing in that I would rather help other people shine than have my byline out there. I mean, I've definitely written. I've written on Medium. But I just prefer to do that. And also I think, editing is not just line editing a story, right? It's also helping a writer frame a story, frame an idea. It's helping writers grow, helping them get their training, sitting down with them and walking them through, how to become, a better writer, as this man was talking about. It's also, depending on what role you have, and I've certainly had these kinds of roles. I think everyone here has things like, running a whole vertical or running a team, learning how to be a manager, managing people, doing strategy and planning, doing editorial planning, doing content strategy, doing digital strategy, doing social strategy. I've done all of those things as an editor. Editor is this one word that means so many things. So, depending on the editorial position, you might do some or all of that. So I think, when it comes to actually editing a story, there's these particular things that we're talking about. And then there's the role. Do you want to be out there, doing the interview? Do you want to be actually putting the story together? I don't want to do that. That's just, I just know that about myself. I'm shy. I'm not going to be super comfortable walking up to someone, asking them for a quote. I don't feel comfortable doing that. I feel very comfortable pushing someone else to do it, supporting them and helping them, get over that or whatever they need. That's, I'm also I don't really want to be in the spotlight. I want to be behind the scenes. And that's just, so I think some of it's temperamental. I think some of it's skill-based. I'm a good writer, not an amazing writer. I'm a much better editor. But I think all of this is about, figuring out what you're really good at. Something like Sean is an amazing producer. That's not something that anyone can do. That has a particular skill set too. So, I think it's a combination of a lot of those things for what it's worth.
Okay, excellent. Thank
Yeah.
you.
I also think that if you're a writer and you find a good editor, you should hold on to them for dear life. Because really, because editors are doing so much more. They're editing so many more stories, and there's so much strap for time.
Yeah.
If you have somebody who will actually give you time, who will work with you on a piece, I mean, I think take that deal and don't worry about. It may not be the ideal outlet, it may not be the ideal beat, but you can learn so much from that person. And this is, I think this is one of the real tragedies right now of the collapse in the journalism market is the ability for mentorship is really declining, and it makes it really hard for people who are new and who don't want somebody punitive to tell them what they didn't do. They want help, and they want somebody to like. I mean, I view my role as editor is like, sort of, there's some percentage words and there's some percentage shrink. And, like that role is really, really important. So if you find that person, celebrate that and hold on to them.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Anybody else?
Hi. My name is Rakia Bell. I attend St. Peter's University. I'm currently a junior, and I noticed that all of you participated in some sort of extended program beyond undergraduate, and I wanted to know how beneficial that was to your careers and how you integrate that currently.
I didn't.
I didn't either.
But you did. You went to
I
the
did. I
publishing
did.
program.
I mean, for me, it meant everything. It was really important for me. I think it was a great space. I always say, there's nothing better than being around people in the industry, learning from people in the industry, like in spaces like this, but also the publishing course was literally taught by people in the industry. Like they would come for their lunch breaks and teach courses. And so it was a really great space to learn, but then also network. And so I think, those sort of post-bac courses, if you can get involved with them, they are great, but they're not necessary. There are other spaces like this, like I said, where you can also meet people and, network and, get into different roles. I would say actually the best piece of sort of advice I've been given and I give to people is also to network within your peers, because you never know who other people are going to be, what doors they'll get into, what opportunities they'll have, and if a door opens for them and they know, like I said, my friend left one job and knew they were opening something at another one, and she's a peer. So I think as much as we tend to look up, I think sometimes we need to look around, look around and really kind of work with your peers in terms of like editing. Have them look at your stuff. If you're, if you have a Medium post or a Medium blog and you want to put it up, maybe have one of your friends look at it. Just be involved with people on your own sort of peer level, and that's equally, I think, as important as aspirationally, spaces.
There are definitely journalists who think that you do have to go to journalism school. I was thinking about that when you were mentioning that earlier. And I always out myself right away and go, well, I didn't. So I would be such a hypocrite to hold any applicant to that standard. I didn't go to J school. I did go to graduate school, but I didn't go to J school. But yeah, there's lots of reasons why people can and can't and do and don't, go to school beyond college. And I think that, to your point, there's so many different ways of furthering your education. When I was coming up, there wasn't YouTube, it wasn't Skillshare, there weren't workshops like this. I mean, I didn't even know internships really existed. I had no idea. It was really a different time when I was coming up. So there's so many other ways of broadening yourself and getting an education that if you do want to go further, if you have that hunger, it sounds like you are really interested in that. I think there's definitely graduate school, and there are other paths too. And I would say if you are interested in graduate school, definitely J school is definitely an option. But to the point of what you were saying before about specialty and expertise. I know plenty of journalists. We have a lot of journalists at Quartz who are experts in their subject area. One of our senior science reporters has a PhD in chemistry. And he really draws on that. And we have multiple other people at Quartz who are lawyers or who have other graduate degrees that they really do use, and they've really become experts. So and that's really provided a lot of value. So as you look ahead and map things out, there isn't one path, which is obvious from the people up here. We've had such different paths, but whatever whether you're going to become a subject expert and whether you want to become, pursue higher education in a subject area, that might work, or it might be in a skill area. If you really love, video, you could become really skilled, at shooting and editing video. Whatever it is, there's a lot of opportunity to grow and then to continue to do so for ongoing professional development. You can zig and zag in different ways in your career. I certainly have. It sounds like people here certainly have. And I've hired a lot of people who have. So, even if you do start out as an expert in something, you could pivot. And I think there's a lot of opportunity now to do that and to become an autodidact in some ways and to learn in other ways. So I think there are a lot of ways to do what you're describing, I think.
Also, we're all interested in people who are multidimensional and interesting. People who tell me that there's a 3-year gap in their resume because they went and helped raise barns somewhere is totally fascinating to me, and actually maybe puts them a tiny bit ahead of the pack just because they've lived life and it's interesting.
Life experience.
We hired somebody recently who was a dancer for Martha Graham, and that's what she did for a while, and then she decided she wanted to be back in journalism. I thought that was totally great. And just celebrate whatever it is that you love, and I think that in itself will appeal.
Absolutely. Great.
Anybody else? We have time for one more. Max just gave me the hook. Thank you all very much for coming. Please join me in thanking our panel.
Thank you.